Hello, everyone. We're going to be studying from Deuteronomy, primarily in chapter 30 today, but let's go ahead and start with a prayer. Our God and Father in heaven, thank you for this day, and thank you for all that you are and all that you do. You alone are worthy of glory and honor and power and praise, and we thank you for the many blessings that you give to us. We know that you alone are in control. We pray that we put our trust in you always. Please be with us as we strive to live faithful lives. May we put you first in all things. May we remember that this world is not our home, and that you give us a greater purpose and an eternity to look forward to. Be with all of those who need your help. Be with your church the world over, and help us to look for opportunities to be good and kind to each other. Help us to be a light in our community, and for more to know you. In Jesus' name, amen. The book of Deuteronomy primarily contains Moses' second proclamation of the covenant that God was making with the fledgling nation of Israel. At this point, they were still a nation without an established land. They didn't have a real home yet. They had fled Egypt, and that God had freed them from their bondage, and he promised to lead them and provide for them. It's in Deuteronomy that we find what Jesus called the greatest commandment in the law. This is in Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This command is fundamental. God wanted his people to give him their everything. That was very much true in that covenant. Nothing has changed in the covenant that we are under today, by the way, and not regarding that fundamental truth. We're going to show that as we continue on. But in every covenant God has ever made with man, this is the underpinning that supports it. Another fundamental part of God's covenant is the idea of a radical binary choice. It's binary because there are only two options. And that's kind of a controversial thing to say, because if you imagine your life in a vacuum, you have an infinite number of choices to pursue. Any number of philosophies to live by, religions to follow or not follow, interests and jobs and goals to pursue. You have an infinite number of choices, but really they distill down to a single binary choice. We'll talk more about that in a moment. It's radical because the positive choice involved requires the total surrender that we already saw in Deuteronomy 6:5. So the main text that I want us to consider today is the explanation of that radical binary choice in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through 20. In fact, there's a number of passages we could pick to explain this. This is not the only time in the book of Deuteronomy that Moses makes a statement like this, but this is a good one that I want us to look at today. So let's read in Deuteronomy 30, beginning in verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you will live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. This passage is one that I tend to allude to a lot, either overtly or sometimes implicitly. So you may have caught on to that in previous lessons that I've given, but I think it's good for us to look specifically at what is happening here in the context of God's covenant with Israel, and then extending it to the covenant that God has made with us. So there's three main things that we need to look at. We have the choice that God gives them, the conditions that set up that choice, and then the consequences of the choice that they make. So first off, the choice itself. As we mentioned before, it is a binary choice. So in one sense, there's an infinite number of ways that they could go, but in reality, it all boils down to two options. An interesting bit of nuance in the Hebrew text is the inclusion of definite articles in verse 15. In English, our definite article is the. And so if you insert those in where they're missing in our translation, it doesn't really radically change anything, but I think it offers just a little bit of nuance and a little bit of emphasis that this is binary. So the choice is between the life and the death, the good and the evil, the blessing and the curse. It's one set of actions that corresponds with the life and the good, and another set that corresponds with the death and the evil. These are not just general categories, and they're not a spectrum of choices either. I mentioned there are other places in Deuteronomy that use this kind of construction, that have this radical binary choice that is offered to the people. One example of that is in chapter 11, verses 26 through 28. And interestingly here, you do get the definite articles put in, at least in verse 27. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way that I am commanding you today to go after other gods that you have not known. So you have the blessing and the curse, the only two options available to them. There is no neutrality. There is no opt-out. There's no spectrum of choices. What we might like to believe is that you have a whole spectrum of good choices, where if you are a little bit good, you get a small blessing. If you're pretty good, you get a medium blessing. And if you're exceptionally good, you get an exceptional blessing. And then the same with the curses, the same with the death, that the worse you are, the more wicked you are, the greater curse you bring upon yourself. Yet, that's not really what is established here. There's only the blessing and the curse, the life, the death. It's binary, one or the other. Now, can we really simplify it that much? Is that oversimplifying? Is that a fair way to assess all of the infinite choices given to us? I strongly believe that yes, that is fair to do. It's fair because God says so, and it's fair because it is the truth. Let's move on to the conditions, and we'll see some of that radical nature involved, and then we'll be able to build on that, seeing both the radical nature and the binary nature. The conditions, the things that set you up on the path for the life or the path for the death. If you are pursuing the life and the good and the blessing, these are the things that God says that the people should do. He's talking to the nation of Israel here. He says, obey the commandments, love the Lord, walk in his ways, and keep his commandments, statutes, and rules. The conditions for the death, the evil, the curse are if your heart turns away, if you will not hear, if you worship other gods, and if you serve other gods. So we addressed the binary part of this choice already, but the radical nature should be what is really evident here. Notice what God requires. For you to be obedient, you have to have humility to be in subjection to him. That is a fundamental change in the way that you view yourself and the way that you view God. To have love means that you will have devotion and sacrificial living. Again, this is about so much more than just surface level actions. This runs deep. And then there's all the consistency of walking and keeping. We're not talking about isolated choices or intermittent actions. We're talking about consistent patterns of behavior, of thoughts, of practices, of deeds. This is supposed to be the totality of our being. Essentially, you can think of this as being another way of saying what was already said in chapter 6, verse 5, the greatest command of giving the Lord all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Further amplifying the radical nature of the choice is seeing that the other side is a choice of exclusion. And that's what's going to help to enlighten both sides of this, really, to better understand why it's really binary and why it's so radical. Once you have not chosen God, does it matter what else you choose? To most people, they'd say, yes, it very much matters what you choose. If I have the choice between being a somewhat wicked person versus, a terrorist, which one do I want to be? But notice in the conditions for choosing the death and the evil that they are choices of exclusion. So God says, if your heart turns away, so you're turning your heart away from God, but what are you turning it toward? It doesn't actually say, because it doesn't matter. If you refuse to hear God, then you are instead going to be hearing something else. Some other voice, some other philosophy, some other God, or even your own voice within yourself. You're listening to somebody or something. Does it matter what? No. Once you are no longer listening to God, you can listen to anything else you want, and you're still on the same path toward the death, the evil, the curse. If you are worshiping and serving other gods, does it matter which ones? Does it matter if you're worshiping the gods of Egypt that you left, since you are one of the Israelites listening to Moses, and you're leaving the nation of Egypt and you're heading towards the promised land? It seems like it would be especially bad to go back to those particular gods, right? In some ways, it doesn't matter. You can worship the gods of Egypt. You can worship the gods of the nations there in the promised land, the people who are about to be kicked out and punished for their own sin. They have completely different gods. You can worship them. You can worship some other god. You can make up a god of your own imagination. It doesn't really matter. Whether they're named gods or implied gods, it doesn't make a difference. Once you are not worshiping and serving God, you're on the path toward the death, the evil, the curse. The infinite spectrum of choices is reduced to a simple truth here. You didn't give God everything. And if that's true, do the details even matter? Well, God tells his people exactly what they should expect, exactly what the consequences are for being on one path or the other. When they choose the path of the life and the good and they follow the corresponding conditions, God says they will live and multiply, and he will bless them in the land that he would give them. If instead they choose the path of the death and the evil and follow the corresponding conditions for that path, which can be anything else that they want, he says they would perish, and they would not live long in the promised land. Now, I want you to notice here that this is not some obscure truth that you have to be an intellectual or religious elite to understand. This is simple cause and effect relationships that even children can understand. Do this in this way, and this will happen. Do anything else in any other way, and this will happen. Those are the two choices. That does not require special enlightenment to understand. Consider as well the nation of Israel itself. Israel was never a global superpower. There was never the Jewish empire. That's kind of a strange combination of words to put together. I don't know of a historian that would ever say something like that, because they never were an empire or a superpower. When Moses spoke these words in Deuteronomy, they didn't even have their land yet. But even later, Israel was always a small nation caught in a tumultuous part of the world. The Bible covers, a couple thousand years for the time of Israel's history, and really at every point in that, there's opportunity for them to be taken advantage of. Empires are rising and falling around them. There are always larger and more advanced countries around them. Sometimes it's Egypt, sometimes it's Babylon, sometimes it's Assyria or Persia or any other nation. And Israel, by contrast, has this little plot of land with a comparatively small number of people and not the same kind of military and technological might as these superpowers around them. Yet, does that mean that they always were wallowing in suffering and despair? Absolutely not. When they chose the life and the good, God gave them victory. They could conquer mighty strongholds. They walked into the land of Canaan as a group of scattered people who did not have great military might and did not have an established base of their own. And they did silly things like march around fortified cities repeatedly until the walls fell down. Do you know why that worked? Because God was with them. God was protecting them. God was giving them what he had promised. When they chose the life and the good, they could conquer mighty strongholds. They could resist onslaughts. Once they even were established, there were other nations around them looking at that land flowing with milk and honey and saying, this would make a nice province in my kingdom. And as long as they were obedient to God, those attacks failed. Israel was able to resist them easily. But when they chose the death and the evil, God made them vulnerable. They would go out to war and they would be destroyed. They would suffer death and hardship. They would suffer their crops being burned. They would suffer captives being taken from any one of their many enemies. These are the consequences that God set up for Israel. It's very simple to understand. Yet, when we look at the call that God gives to them and Israel's historical response, we're kind of disappointed. The ending call of that section in Deuteronomy 30 says, choose the life, choose the good, choose the blessing. It's well worth the radical commitment that God desires. Why would anyone knowingly choose death and destruction? Yes, I know God asks a lot. Yes, I know that God does not want any kind of compromise. But even still, when the blessings are this great and the downside, the curse that awaits you is also so great, why would you not choose what is good? In fact, a little later on, Joshua reiterates that same call. And I want you to notice something fascinating here. This is in Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua setting up the same radical binary choice that Moses had given them, that God had given them just a short time before. Either serve God and be blessed, or do whatever else you want to do and be cursed. And the example I gave earlier about does it matter which gods you serve, that wasn't an arbitrary example. It actually came from this passage right here. Joshua says, if it is evil to you to serve the Lord, then decide who you want to serve. You want to serve the gods of Egypt, where you came from before? Great, have at it. You want to serve the gods of the Amorites that are here among you? Do that. Doesn't matter. It literally makes no difference because those are all evil choices. Those are all false gods, idols, expressions of wickedness and rebellion against God. Does it matter what flavor your rebellion comes in? It simply does not. Now, individual Israelites had different reactions to this, of course. We know that there were always some who were faithful and always some who rebelled. That's human nature right there. You get a group of people together, and you're never really going to see complete and perfect unity. But when you look at Israel as a whole, as a nation, you see that for the most part, they chose death. They chose the curse. Throughout their history, they repeatedly chose destruction. You move on to the book of Judges. You have Israel now mostly established in the land and kind of mopping up the last few peoples that are still there. And the book of Judges gives us a death spiral as you have a nation that is falling deeper and deeper into sin, and judges who are trying to uphold truth and justice and faithfulness to God, and each one gets a little bit worse. And there's a cycle going on in Judges. You might remember this when we talked about Gideon. We did a little series on him a while back. There's a cycle, but it's not a flat cycle. It's a spiral going right down the toilet bowl of Israel's history. Things are just getting worse as time goes on. And by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges, you reach chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Now, if you're going to read that verse and make it a commentary on the simple historical truth that they didn't have kings yet, you've missed the point. Sure, they didn't have kings yet, but that doesn't really require that sort of statement of finality to cap off the book of Judges. They didn't have a king throughout the entire book of Judges. They have the judges that God established. No, instead, this is reflecting the reality that Israel always had a king. God was supposed to be their king, yet in those days, there was no king because they were not in subjection to God. In truth, God was their king and always had been, but they didn't want to listen to him. They would not hear. Their hearts had turned away. They were worshiping and serving other gods. You see these connections? They chose the death. So Israel gets its physical kings, men to wear crowns and levy taxes and send people off to war and all the good things that kings do. But that's mostly a failure. The very first human king that Israel gets is Saul, and he rejects God totally. David is a bright spot, although he has some bumpy spots as well. But he's faithful. He's good. Solomon has some extreme highs and some extreme lows. He's fairly complicated, to say the least. And then, of course, the kingdom gets divided and everything goes down the drain. The whole thing gets substantially worse because what was one nation is now two. And the northern kingdom, Israel, never has a good king. From that point on, it's wicked kings all the way down the line. Judah in the south has some good kings, but even in a lot of those good kings, the people are still holding on to wickedness very tightly. All along the way, prophets are warning, stop choosing the death. Remember what God promised you. Remember the covenant God established. He said, if you do this, then death awaits you. Both in the short term, because your choices are not arbitrary and God's commands are not arbitrary. In the short term, you have a difficult life and you have pain and suffering that you can't avoid, that you are instead having to endure, but you are also storing up wrath for the future. As an example, Isaiah talks about how Israel had so completely distorted their covenant with God that they made it a covenant of death. In Isaiah 28 and verse 18, then your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, you will be beaten down by it. That's depressing. And it's also a little ironic that God was trying to give them a choice of the life, the good, the blessing, and they instead said, we'll make a covenant with death. What kind of person does that? What kind of person willingly chooses death? A person who wants freedom. A person who does not want to be bound to the strict and radical standard of the positive choice to serve God. By the time Jesus is ready to come into the world, we know Israel and Judah had been taken into captivity. Israel never really came back as a nation. Judah did, but they're in rough shape. Physically, because they're vassals of Rome, and spiritually, because they've heavily distorted God's law. It always amazes me. You can read through the Old Testament and you get this idea of what God's law is, and then you pick up in Matthew and you go, whoa, what has happened? Who are these people? What are these teachings? There are all sorts of traditions and commands and laws that the religious leaders are talking about that I just don't remember seeing anywhere in the actual covenant God made with his people. You go, did I miss something? Is there some book that is omitted? Is there some chapter I forgot to read? No, that's not it. It's that they had distorted the law. Now, they chose to keep some facade that they were still worshiping God. That's fine. But do you know what that is? That's still the road that goes to the death. There's a whole spectrum of things you can choose on that side because of the choice of exclusion. They chose the one that still has this little threadbare image of worshiping Yahweh, and really it doesn't matter. They could have been worshiping the gods of the Romans, the gods of the Philistines, the gods of the Egyptians, and it wouldn't have made a difference because they were following wickedness. What about today? We've spent a lot of time today talking about a covenant that was not made for us. I'm not a Jew. You're probably not a Jew. And even if you were, this covenant isn't in force anymore. So we're looking at what maybe some would say are the finer details of a covenant that doesn't exist anymore. Is this all outdated? Does God still work this way? There are certainly differences in covenants. There are details that change. There are even some big things that change. But there are fundamental truths that remain the same because it's not really about the covenant, it's about the nature of God. It's about what God wants from his people. God has a certain way that he deals with people, things that he always does. Whether you're talking about the covenant he made with Israel, the covenant he's made with us today, or any other covenant, there are others, smaller ones, and with individuals, with families, other things that happened in times past, that these fundamental truths were still the same. So you should probably read Hebrews 3 to better understand the point we're about to make here. If you take notes or you want to scribble down a note, write down Hebrews 3. It'd be a good thing for you to read. But I want to look at Hebrews 4, verses 1 and 2, to see something important. Hebrews 4, 1 and 2. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, and Hebrews 3 will show you that the them there is the Israelites in that covenant God made with them. The good news came to us just as it came to them. But the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. Under the Old Covenant, they had a message to hear and obey that would benefit them if they did. Boy, does that sound familiar. That's a choice, a condition, and a consequence. It's the same thing there. And we know they mostly did not do that. We're supposed to take a lesson from that. The Hebrew writer is saying, learn something from their insane mistake of choosing the death. How about you choose the life instead? We have the promise of entering his rest. While that promise stands, we should be united by faith with those who listened. So yeah, the details of covenants vary, but the need to make a radical binary choice still remains the same. Well, we see, but it's radical. Is it really binary? Is that the outdated part? Because I see here in Hebrews 4 that it's radical, that it requires us to listen and to obey. But, God was so strict back then. He's a God of love now. God is just so different now than he used to be. Is it really the same for us? God hasn't changed. Like I said, details of covenants can vary, but the nature of God is the same, and these fundamental truths are the same. Consider something from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 7, 13 and 14. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy, but leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. You realize that that's basically another way of creating a binary choice. One that is a difficult, strict, positive choice that has many conditions to meet, and the other that's wide and easy because it's a choice of exclusion. It has a whole spectrum of things that you can do within it. It's the exact same setup. Choose the life on the narrow path that leads to a narrow gate, or choose literally anything else you want on the wide and easy path that leads to a broad gate open for anyone and their own variation of philosophy that they want to follow. God wants us to obey him, and he wants everything that we have to give. He wants your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about in regards to covenants. We've touched on some important things here that need to be discussed in more detail. I want to do that soon. The idea of covenants is a really fascinating one, and seeing how God makes covenants with man and what exactly a covenant is all incredibly important. So we'll do that soon. But I thought it was good for us to establish this basic idea that actually has a lot for us to explore. The idea of a radical binary choice. But this is the way God works. And this is what God presents his people. It gives us a framework to understand God's expectations. And it allows us to do what the Hebrew writer talks about in learning a lesson from God's chosen people in times past. They were given the choice. Choose the life. Choose the good. Choose the blessing. And it's hard to do that. It's hard because God requires so much from you. But the blessings outweigh the requirements. Or, if that's too hard for you, if that's not agreeable to you, if that is evil in your eyes and you want to do something else, then go do whatever it is you feel like doing. Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what flavor of evil you pursue. It leads to the same place. And so it doesn't even help you to have a shred of religious facade. It still leads to the death. That's harsh. That's too bold. It's too binary. But I didn't make this up. So I can't say it's to anything. That's the charge many people want to lay against God, but this is the way God works. This is what God desires. And as the creator, as the king, he has the right to demand it. So, you can disagree with it, and that won't get you anywhere. Or you can accept it. You can understand that this is what God does, this is the choice he has presented you with, and you can choose the choice that leads to incredible blessings. Thank you, brethren and friends. Consider these things. To God be the glory in all that we do. May we put him first. May we choose life. May we choose the reward. And may we further the work of the kingdom as we do so. Thank you.